Thank you very much, Tracy, and so nice to be back. When people read my bio, I'm reminded how I have aged because I graduated from this wonderful academic institution in 1992. So I'm extremely grateful for the invitation. Thank you, Sir Jim, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and friends from Malawi and everybody who has shown up. It's always such a delight and a pleasure to return to my alma mater and to be with all of you, especially at this moment, to mark such a momentous occasion in the university's history is even more special for me. So thank you for inviting me to speak with you here today. This university will forever occupy a special place in my heart. It catalyzed my curiosity in humanity, science, and the planet. It was a special place that used both my head and my heart in its approach to education. And I left Strathclyde with a strong desire to use my life to serve others. I am forever indebted to the knowledge I gained and the lifelong friendships I made here. As you might imagine, arriving in Glasgow in the late 80s was an eye-opening experience for a young Tanzanian girl who grew up in the foothills of Kilimanjaro and also in Dar es Salaam. Glasgow was my first ever, literally, from Dar es Salaam to London, taking a train to come to the train station. It was an eye-opening experience. I stepped off the train and into the world that was as unfamiliar to me as the square sausage is to a French chef. It was my introduction to haggis and the strange meteorological phenomenon known as the permanent rainy season. The differences between Glasgow and my homeland were invigorating, opening my eyes to a world of possibility. But there were strange similarities too when people asked what I thought about the men in tartan skirts. I would point out that I already had some familiarity with this. Our own Maasai tribesmen are famous for the plaid robes they wear. Cross-cultural connections like this have always struck me. Indeed, through my career, I have continually sought out the similarities that unite us as humans, the common threads that run through all of us, stitching us together into the vast tapestry of life. I believe these threads, which connect all of us, are woven from our most fundamental aspirations: the desire to live lives of meaning and purpose, the right to lives free from violence, oppression, persecution, and fear, the right of people everywhere to improve life for themselves and for their families, to lead lives of meaning and purpose. And I believe it is when we forget this, when we forget our common humanity, that the threads that bind us start to come undone with terrible, terrible consequences. Political and societal polarization, conflict and violence, injustice and suffering. And it is when we forget our common humanity that we fail to respond appropriately to the world's escalating humanitarian crisis. It is a painful fact that today more people are in need of urgent life-saving assistance than at any time since World War II today. And yet, despite these soaring needs, Funding from wealthy donors, nations is drying up, forcing emergency responders to make painful decisions about what forms of life-saving aid to cut. It is as if we have forgotten our shared humanity. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the way the world treats Africa's humanitarian crisis. Of the 10 most neglected displacement crises in the world, 9 are in Africa. And of the top 10 most underreported humanitarian crises in the world, all are in Africa. Burundi has one of the highest malnutrition rates in the world. Zambia is struggling to cope with the intensifying climate crisis. Civil war in Sudan has left 25 million people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. That's half the country's population before the war. Long-running conflict and armed rebellions mean Central Africa is now home to one of the largest communities of internally displaced people on the continent. Mozambique and Malawi are being battered year after year by some of the worst cyclones ever recorded as the climate crisis continues to hit those least responsible the hardest. Rarely do we hear about countries like Angola, where droughts and flash floods have destroyed agricultural harvests, leaving 7.8 million people in need of humanitarian assistance as food insecurity and malnutrition spikes. And if we do hear about these tragedies, then it is often only in the unfinished stories of people desperately trying to reach Europe in search of safety and a better life. But how often do we hear about the conflicts, economic shocks, extreme weather, poverty, and inequality driving them to leave their homes in the first place? The underreporting of this crisis is echoed in the inadequate levels of funding they receive from the world's richest nations. The continent is home to 27 of the 40 countries most vulnerable to the climate crisis, and yet Africa receives just a fraction of the financing needed to help communities adapt. Never have humanitarian needs been higher, and yet the funding gap has never been greater. In Africa, as elsewhere, this is stretching the humanitarian system to breaking point. There is an Igbo proverb that goes, I quote, "If our neighbor's home is being eaten by bad insects, we are not going to have a peaceful sleep either," end of quote. The proverb is a warning about what happens when we disregard our shared humanity. It is a reminder that we cannot afford to think of ourselves as alone and disconnected from the rest of humanity, that care for one another is fundamental to our own well-being, that we are all interconnected, that what happens to you also happens to me. This view, which is shared by wisdom traditions around the world, is easy to forget in an increasingly divided and multipolar world. It is easy to focus on the differences between us, to build up walls and retreat behind the narratives of us and them. But we have been there before. We know the terrible costs. We must resist this urge and instead find ways to cooperate, collaborate, and compromise. And that means working across our differences, seeking out our common humanity, the common threads that unite us. In Africa, this means building genuine partnerships with organizations and communities working on the front lines of the continent's humanitarian crisis. And doing this requires dismantling several obstacles that stand in the way. Some of these are bureaucratic and regulatory. Some are born from the geopolitical calculations of donor countries, the political agendas, and great power rivalry that ignores the interests of recipient governments, NGOs, and communities. But often these obstacles arise because African voices are simply excluded from the humanitarian decision-making. Too often, the powerful role that local organizations and communities can play in responding to crises are overlooked and tokenized. To change this, we must first acknowledge the racial and cultural biases that continue to exist within the humanitarian structures. I live this life every single day as part of what I'm saying here. Until the perspectives and voices of crisis hit people, and especially the voices of women, are put at the very heart of humanitarian decision-making, we will fail to eliminate the power imbalances that govern international relations. This is about redistributing power so that people on the front lines are the ones guiding humanitarian action. By including these people at every single level of decision-making, we can ensure that our actions are shaped by their priorities and not ours. Second, more financial aid needs to be channeled through local and national partners to ensure that humanitarian action is truly grounded in the needs of people living in crisis. In Mozambique, I met women going door to door to speak with survivors of what was then the world's worst cyclone. These women understood the needs on the ground and were able to respond with speed and flexibility to ever-shifting priorities. Groups like this have a better grasp of what needs to be done. They have deep roots in the communities they serve. They understand the drivers of crisis. They understand the dignity of the communities they serve. These are the groups we must empower to lead the response to Africa's humanitarian emergencies. There are promising signs that this shift is underway. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, where I work, has worked hard to set up country-based pool funds, allowing countries to respond rapidly to the most acute humanitarian needs. But change is slow. Almost 10 years ago, the world's richest donor countries pledged to channel 1/4 of all aid money to recipient governments and local organizations. We are woefully short of this target. And yet we know that when people design their own solutions, they are far more likely to implement them. So it's time to truly act on the promises of the past. I would now like to turn my focus to what universities and other institutes of higher learning can do to build the kinds of partnerships necessary to tackle the challenges we see in Africa. How can academic institutes catalyze the changes we urgently need to see? Well, first, as I have said, it's about putting local organizations at the heart of everything we do. It's about dropping our preconceived ideas about what needs to be done and really listening to people on the front lines of the world's emergencies. Strathclyde's University One Ocean Hub is a shining example of exactly the kind of partnership that we need more of. The hub brings together coastal people, national universities, civil society, researchers, decision makers, and international organizations in its mission to find just and sustainable ways to address the catastrophic changes taking place in the world's oceans. This work has opened up spaces for new voices. It has brought marginalized forms of knowledge to the center of the discussion, opening up fresh perspectives and new solutions. And it has allowed the hub to advance the world's understanding of local and customary knowledge in ways that have real power to transform the social and environmental injustices that harm the marine world. I have seen firsthand the power that different forms of knowledge can have in responding to humanitarian emergencies. In Mozambique, I met elders whose deep knowledge of local weather patterns helps villagers move out of the way of increasingly destructive cyclones. Local knowledge like this is often ignored, but it saves lives. Our well-being is inextricably linked to the well-being of others. I want to leave you with that thought because it seems to me that if we are going to address the continent's crisis, then we are going to need to act from this very simple yet revolutionary understanding of our common humanity. If we can do this, then the way we respond to Africa's humanitarian crisis becomes not just a moral duty, but an act of absolute necessity for the health and well-being of every single one of us. Thank you.
What can we do to try and kind of leverage technology and other opportunities to really maximize the opportunities for young people to make the continent a better place?
I always, maybe from my biochemistry training here, I like comparisons. Everything is relative. I mean, I grew up in Tanzania in the 70s when Tanzania was trying to be a socialist country under Nyerere's leadership. And I went to public schools throughout my education. And then from 2018 to 2022, I lived in Kenya. This was after I left Tanzania in '89 to come to Strathclyde and then went to other places for academic. What can you do to, or rather, your question on young people? I actually think Africa has changed. I mean, when I was in Kenya, the average young person in East Africa had way much more access, technology. Now I'm talking about the cities. There is the inequality story, which is different. But in terms of opportunities and the knowledge, because of the power of technology and social media, I was pleasantly surprised. You think about the M-Pesa innovations and what have you that have happened. Most of these were actually born and bred in Africa. So what can you do? I think one is to look at Africa and nuance it. There are 54 countries. I've traveled all over Africa. Burkina Faso is different from East Africa. You go to Middle East, it's different. And the size of economies are very different. So one, what gives me hope first is the regional integration. Like we do a lot of work with East Africa community, SADC, to bring the scale. Why? Because I lived in China, in South Korea, particularly China. I've seen the power of scale. I think two is education. I grew up in a family where my father and late mother used to say, you do sciences, STEM, but you use that as a foundation to build a house, whatever you want to do. And even today in my executive role, I use a lot of scientific foundations to actually make decisions, evidence-based. I think three is entrepreneur. The private sector is booming for most African countries, small, medium enterprises included. So how do you bring the youth into that part of the story and engaging with them? We are trying to do that even in the humanitarian sector. And sometimes we get very humbling feedback of what we should stop doing. So I think also listening to the young people, and institutions such as this have the power to do so. Thanks.
My name is Adres Malata, a Vice Chancellor for Malawi University of Science and Technology. But I wanted to find out whether we should also be looking at, within Africa, what can we do together? So much as North-South collaboration is good, I've always felt that within our region, there isn't much integration, collaboration.
Thank you for your question. I think the first question is on the cooperation beyond young people. There is still more to be done. Frankly, I think in my remarks also I spoke about how we close the gap of polarization. I sit in some of these very, very big meetings, you know, in New York and other places. And what I see, especially in the current world we are living in, is less cooperation and more competition, and sometimes with political clouds around it. But I've also learned cooperation requires compromise. So the question amongst leaders, no matter where you are, whether you're in the US or Tanzania or anywhere, is their willingness to actually collaborate for goodness, is their willingness to listen. But also what gives me hope is, if I think of the continent, you have leaders who are much more vocal than before. I've traveled a lot in the Sahel. We have big programs because of climate and conflict. And the new generation of leaders, as imperfect as they are quite determined to chart their own path of how they want to run the countries. The opportunity there is to engage, and most of them are young, sort of second generation post-colonial leaders. How can they look at collaboration and cooperation differently? But I've also believed as the world is interconnected, I'm a mother of 2 children, and I always tell young adults, they remind me they are not children anymore, they're young adults, because I want them, if they see this video, But they always say, I always tell them, you have to think about the whole world is your competitor. It's not just where you were born. And what kind of skill set do you need to have to succeed? Because their world will be very different from mine. So I think, if I think of, to be very honest, if I think of when I was growing up in Tanzania, the transformational guidance was think global but act local. So when I was doing physics, chemistry, and biology in a boarding school, my aspiration was to do Cambridge exams and compete with anyone in the world. So everything I've done thus far has been grounded from public education in sciences from Tanzania, when Tanzania per capita was poorer than it is today. And when I go back, since you're coming from academic institution, when I see University of Dar or other schools, I wonder whether we have the same quality of education as I did. And that is, I tell people that I know who are in the government, that is a reflection. Can the Tanzanian kids who are graduating today compete with Americans, with Chinese, with Koreans? I lived in South Korea, for example, and really seeing the power of education. But I competed because of the lived education experience that I've had. So there are multi-layered things, but leadership is key, and the long-term leadership. On the question about how do we get to the table, it depends what table and where the table is. But on a more serious note, I think, when I took on this role and I applied, I didn't know anybody, just like UNEP. I didn't realize I was going to be the first ever Assistant Secretary-General from Global South, leave alone Africa. Now, has it been a walk in the park? No. But I'm a fighter in a nice way, by excellence. So most of us, Africans, shy away from the difficult things. I'm actually attracted to the difficult things. I've always believed doing plain vanilla does not get you where you should be. And by doing difficult things, I was telling Tracy, like moderating this session, you actually grow a different leadership muscle. So most of us need, as I tell especially women, if you don't have a chair, the seat, bring your own folded chair and say, I'm here. Whether you like it or not, I'm here. But you have to prepare to be at the table. You cannot just wishy-washy no. Because I know, and I'm mindful, when I walk through the door, the world and whoever is in the room has already judged me. What that means is I have to put in 150%. This speech, I was prepping from my flight from New York, Geneva, last night, because I wanted to be sure what I'm delivering is what I believe. So being part of the table comes with responsibility of bringing the A game to the table. 2 is education. I've spoken about it, including what Strathclyde did to me. At the world table, it's very complex. I spent 20 years at the World Bank Group. It's cutthroat competition, but if you can do it, and then you have to think about the younger generation. One of the things I enjoy is mentoring, because I've been a beneficiary of mentors. So how do we bring others, the younger Joyces, the younger Johns, so when we leave and retire, they come and take. Taking a global view, I love Tanzania, and I still have family there. But I also know by sitting at the table in New York, I represent not just Tanzania, but also Africa and the global south. So if all of us just retract and go to that beautiful Dar es Salaam or Zanzibar, then we miss a chair at the table. So there is also sacrifice that some of us have to take.
Francesco Sindico, Professor of International Environmental Law here at the Law School. Thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned cyclones, you mentioned lack of finance. So I was just interested in your perspective, looking forward to COP29, on are you optimistic? What are your thoughts about where loss and damage is going, where obviously Scottish Government kick-started the process internationally as well, and the big issue at Baku, which will be climate finance?
COP29, am I optimistic? I think Francesco. You know, hope is the currency of humanitarian. Let me start there. So I'm very optimistic. I'm actually on the International Advisory Council of COP29. As you know, Azerbaijan was asked to chair at the very last minute, so they're really trying to do as much as they can. Financing is a big issue. I was in South Korea when the Green Climate Fund was born, and I know about Jeff. What we are seeing now, most of the big donors, not just to climate financing, but also development and humanitarian, you have countries that are moving to the right, Sweden, Netherlands, and others. So the ideological around ODA and financing is changing. God help us in the US in November, couple of weeks, what will happen. So depending on the political shifts, I don't know. I think the second is the scale of the challenge is massive and very much interconnected. So there is competition of the needs. If you look at humanitarian, just for 2024, we are estimating 300 million people need assistance. Just 2024, whilst the budgets are shrinking. And that also is applicable to climate. On loss and damage, as you know, it's been very political. Now that there is the secretariat that has been established, the new CEO is a good friend of mine. He has a very tough job. But the question is, where will the new money come in? Because also you have countries that are financing crisis, Ukraine and others. So there is competition of resources when the needs, but I'm very optimistic. What I find about COPs, and I've been going to a couple of them, is the side conversations. For example, the role of the private sector in financing. Even the General Assembly that happened in New York, there were some really interesting Wall Street conversations around climate financing. That's where the deep pockets are. Public financing is a bit tricky.
My name is Joyce Chivunga from the Malawi University of Science and Technology. And my question is on the fundamental shift in our values. You mentioned that academic institutions have tremendous power in shaping behaviors. Sometimes this tremendous power is overpowered by culture. In your experience at the United Nations, have you ever had a scenario where culture has overpowered all the initiatives that you're making to solve the challenges? What would you advise to be the best approach in dealing with culture? Thank you.
I think what I have learned, you know, it's interesting, the notion of culture. I wish I was younger and maybe do a PhD or something on, maybe when I retire, on culture. Because I have traveled a lot. And I've gone to places like Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Colombia, obviously grew up in Tanzania and lived in Asia for 7 years. And now I live in the US and lived in Canada and obviously Scotland. I've come to realize we actually have more in common in culture. We nuance differently in societies. Why do I say that? For example, the culture of giving back to communities. For most religions, for most villages, even in IDP camps, internally displaced camps that I visited a woman in Yemen who has nothing, and she had a tomato and a plant in her tent to welcome me to her tent. That is the culture I grew up in Tanzania. When you have a guest, you welcome them. So on the culture, I would argue one, culture is very dynamic. When I made a point that universities have a role, when I came here, coming from Tanzania, and 89, Glasgow of 89 is different from Glasgow of today. I was walking around, I was like, wow, this is George Square, this is the bar I used to go to, but it's no longer there, for example. But what I appreciated was the warm hospitality and welcoming of Scottish people. Because I didn't know, and there were not many people who looked like me then, trust me, okay, in here. And I think Glasgow was the European city of culture around that time. So culture is you have to nuance it.
So I'm Jackie Stewart. I'm from Strathclyde, the Department of Social Work and Social Policy. But I've only been here for 5 months. I come from South Africa. And one of the most interesting examples, recent examples, I think, of Global North not necessarily allowing Global South or the continent of Africa to have a seat at the table was around the issue of Mpox, which has been in Africa for decades and is being spoken about in Africa CDC for years, and I just wondered if you had much experience with it or any thoughts on it.
I think, look, the Mpox is a classic example of the need of inclusion and ownership. I'm actually very optimistic. The fact there is Africa CDC, I see already resources moving from WHO Afro to Africa CDC. There's need to be a bit of organization there. I'm sure you know what I mean. But bottom line is, are there inbound resources? South Africa is one of the richest countries. So domestic, regional resources that could help CDC. I think some of the partnerships with pharmaceutical industries, including, for example, what Rwanda is trying to do with the investments, Kenya, and even West Africa, give promising, but from a regulatory perspective, I feel the capacity and the expertise is a bit limited, but we can take it offline.
Fantastic. I know that we could listen to Joyce for the next, actually the whole day, really, and have lots more and more questions for her. I think, could you join me in giving an absolutely huge thank you to Joyce for her time?